This screencast presentation is an introduction to some of the mapping concepts and techniques that we're going to be using in the International Fieldwork module and should be watched in preparation for the Fieldwork workshop. Maps are really important not only as an analytical tool, a way of finding out about places, but also a way of communicating information about places. So the map that we're looking at here denotes different land uses over different time periods in and around the city of Amsterdam. I haven't included a key because I'm not going to go into the detail of this, but if you think about an alternative way of describing information such as different land uses within a city and different eras of development within a city, and you thought about doing that in written form, you would have quite a long and dense narrative timeline that was describing lots of different eras of development, but it would be very hard to actually visualize that. A map here communicates that information really clearly. So this map uses color, but we can use different techniques to describe different features of the map. So what we're looking at really with maps are visual representations of analytical data. And I want us to start thinking about maps as more than just something that communicates descriptive data or something that we use to find where we are. As geographers and environmental scientists, you will already, I'm sure, have used maps in different ways to find out different kinds of information about an area and to make decisions about an area. So we're going to be talking today about three different kinds of data that you may see on a map and that you may be using to produce maps of your own: descriptive, experiential, and analytical data. I also want to talk to you about the decision about what to map and how actually mapping is no less factually accurate than any other kind of data. It's a decision, an analytical decision that the creator of the map has made in terms of deciding what goes on that map. And that's a really important process. We're also going to be talking about how you choose how to map, so different techniques for actually communicating information in a visual form. And finally, I'm going to show you a few examples of something called academic annotation, which is a way that you can include academic references on visual representations of information. So first of all, let's talk about descriptive data, because that's probably the way in which most of us encounter maps for the first time. So this is a map of the city campus, which some of us may not have been on very often this year so far, but it's still there. So this is what I would call a map that contains descriptive data. In other words, this is showing you kind of locational data, where things are and what they are. So it shows you the location of buildings, it shows you the different function of buildings, and also where some kind of key services are, such as cash points, places you can eat. There are quite a lot of things that this also doesn't tell us. So it doesn't tell us anything about those features. It doesn't tell us the quality of the places that you can eat. It doesn't tell you how it feels to walk around that campus at different times of day. It doesn't tell you whether it feels safe, whether the street lighting is good. It doesn't give you the crime rates for the area. It doesn't also include every single feature of that particular site. So it is there's a decision. This is a map produced by the university, so it focuses upon the university facilities, which is understandable. But there's obviously lots of other things happening on that site that aren't included on this map. So whilst it is descriptive and certainly contains accurate information about the location of certain services, it isn't saying everything about that area, and it isn't telling us everything we might need to know about an area. For that, we need to dig a little bit deeper. But before we move on from this map, I'd also like you to notice the ways in which information is communicated, the graphic techniques that have been used to create this map. So we would see this instantly and recognizably as a map, but it doesn't include, as I say, every single thing that's going on there. It's an edited version of reality. It's prioritizing certain features of that site in order to draw your attention to them and not just add everything in there, which would make it a very confusing picture that you couldn't decipher very clearly. So the techniques that have been used here are simple blocks of colour and line. If you can imagine producing this yourself, you would be using sort of creating polygons and colouring them in. Then there'd be those symbols that are used in the key that you would place around the site to show different locations of different goods and services. So I want us to sort of notice here not only what the map is doing, but how it is communicating information, what graphic techniques are being used to do that. Here's another example of a map that's communicating locational data and descriptive data. But what's happening here is that there's been there's been a different set of decisions that have been made about what to include on the map, what information to include on the map, and what to obscure. So this map is a map of Detroit, and it's showing the blue and green infrastructure of that city. So there's obviously lots and lots of other things there, but this map isn't showing them. It's grayed those out. It's kind of left those to one side for now, and it's focusing exclusively on showing us the blue and green infrastructure of the city. So again, if you can imagine that if everything else had been left in there, all the roadways, all the transport infrastructure, all the different land uses, all the buildings, it would be very hard for us to get a visual sense of that blue and green infrastructure. So by making a decision to only include certain information from the map, it gives us a really clear picture of the thing that we're supposed to be looking at. So again, this is that process of deciding what to map and thinking about how you can emphasize certain features of the landscape. So this isn't this is an accurate description of certain features of the landscape. There's just an awful lot that isn't included on the map because it's not necessary for this particular analytical task of trying to understand blue and green infrastructure. So this is another example of descriptive data. And again, looking at the techniques that have been used here, we're still looking at blocks of colour denoting different features. We've also got we've got blocks of colour for the different blue and green infrastructure, and then we've got dots and dashes and lines that are also identifying other key features of the map. So again, really nice visual, communicates an awful lot of information, but uses quite simple techniques to do so. So maps aren't only used to communicate descriptive information or locational data, so information about what is in a particular location. They can also be used as visual representations of experiential data. So this is an example of a map that is showing experiential data. This is a sound map of London. So in each of these squares, researchers went and identified what the dominant sounds were in all these different areas of London, and then produced this visual representation, this spatial analysis of the different soundscapes. So you can see in the key here, these are the different things that people were hearing: people's voices, music, sirens, birdsong, a parakeet squawking noise, which is quite specific, and these are the kinds of background noises: the incidental road traffic, air traffic, tools and plants, so that's kind of building work, heavy machinery, factory noises, people walking and slamming doors. So this representation here, you can start to sort of get a sense of maybe the areas of the city that are more sort of more heavily dominated by traffic, and maybe areas of the city that are greener. And it'll be interesting to compare this soundscape map to a map of the green infrastructure of London and have a look whether there was a correlation between the areas where you're seeing more birdsong, parakeets in specific, quite specific birdsong, and greater areas of green. What you can also see is the location of the city airports in terms of the flight paths. So this is kind of giving us a sense of what's there, but it's actually based upon data that was gathered by the researchers in situ. So if you went to this particular area, you wouldn't be guaranteed to hear the same things. You wouldn't necessarily see a parakeet there, but this is based upon experiential data. So the data that based upon the researchers' experiences of being in those locations at that time, represented on a map. This one's a little hard to look at, so I won't linger for too long, but this is a noise map of Amsterdam. So again, this is based upon sound recordings being taken. So rather than the specific kind of, we don't have the different elements and what's making that noise, but we have the noise level. So this would be using, rather than using the experience of the researcher, this would be taking sound measurements at those locations at that time. So again, this is how those areas were being experienced at that time, rather than how they would always be. So the noise levels here, although again we can't see, they're not describing what that noise is, but if we look at the level of noise and we look at the layout of the city, we're starting to see the noisiest areas correspond with the roadways within the city. So it's quite we can sort of infer from this that it's probably sound, and the sound levels there have been generated by traffic. But again, this is data that's experiential. It's not locational data. It's not saying that this is where it is noisy all the time. It's saying when we did this survey, this is how we experience those areas. You could think about using experiential maps for things like perceptions of safety, for other kinds of experiences of place. So quite often we do have safety maps. We have maps about the smellscape as well. So how an area smells in heavy traffic, doesn't smell very nice. Green spaces may smell nicer. So lots of different kinds of experiential maps exist. And now I want to talk to you about analytical data. So this isn't this isn't a map as such, but this is a diagram. And I also want you to think about diagrams as a technique. These are cross-section diagrams, which I'm particularly keen on as a way of communicating information. So we have some different cross-sections of an area here. So these two in the middle that I've focused on show the nitrogen and the water cycle. And this is as nature, this is how the nitrogen cycle works in nature. This is how a nitrogen cycle works in a standard urban area. And this is how the nitrogen cycle could work in an eco-city. Likewise, here's how the water cycle works in nature, how it works in a standard city, and how it could work in an eco-city. So we have here the arrows denoting rainfall. These are trees. This is the water soaking naturally into the land, underwater aquifers, and that draining in river systems, and that draining into the sea, where it evaporates into cloud and forms clouds, and then it precipitates as rain. So you'd be familiar with this one, I'm sure. If we look then to what this is communicating about the water cycle in a city, so water is taken from the water system, stored, provided to the city in terms of piped water. Then that goes into the sewage systems, which gets pumped into the open water systems, or there's runoff from the street level into the water systems from the rain. How it could work in an eco-city: it rains, you have far more green space within cities, so you have that natural process of water soaking into the ground and running off safely. You have green roofs, and you harvest the grey water from buildings and use that in the buildings. And so this is again showing that what we're trying to do here is create cities that mimic natural processes. The way it's communicated is, again, I think these look really effective, but if you actually look at the level of artwork here, I think even if someone said they couldn't draw, they could probably draw most of these things. These are not complicated three-dimensional images. They're very simple sketches that have been that communicate an awful lot of information visually. Here's some more analytical data examples. So again, here's some different sites and the techniques here. So these have almost been done. These have been done by hand. So I wanted to include some examples. So someone's taken a simplified base map, which is something that we'll be looking at in the workshop. And this one shows active frontages. So they've kind of coloured in areas to show what it's like from the street. This one's showing the green infrastructure, and this one's showing land uses. So you can again see that what's happening here is there's been decisions made about what data to include, what to grey out. So it's not including everything that's there, it's emphasising certain features of the site. And that's an analytical process. So when we're trying to analyse a site rather than just describe it, we actually want to be looking at picking out certain features and commenting on those features in terms of how they're functioning in the site. Here's some more examples of analytical data. So again, this is nice because it's the same site in all 6 images. The information that's emphasized in each of those is different. So you can see how, if you can imagine including all of this on one map, you wouldn't be able to pick out anything at all. So by separating these images out into 6 diagrams, colouring in the blocks and using arrows and lines in different ways, which is all we're looking at here. This one shows the vegetation or the green infrastructure. This one shows land use. This is character. So this is sort of talking about not quite as descriptive, but a little bit more analytical. So what's the character of an area? Is it a social space? Is it predominantly a traffic space, an area for sort of traffic movement, that kind of thing? This one shows the main vehicular circulation, so where the traffic is in terms of vehicles. This one shows pedestrian circulation, so the kind of key areas in terms of walking. This one shows a hierarchy, so these are the main routeways for pedestrians that are in the heavier arrows, and the lighter arrows show the sort of secondary and tertiary pedestrian ways. Again, lots and lots of information there communicated using techniques that, if you look at the support videos that have been provided along with this module, you'll see that there's ways that you can do this using very, very sort of basic IT techniques, such as exporting an image into PowerPoint and colouring it in there. So there's a decision to be made when creating a map about what to map. And analytical mapping, which is something that I want us to get into doing, is actually all about deciding what to gather and what to present. So we saw on those previous images that a decision had been made to focus on particular features of a site and to use those to help us understand the characteristics of the site and the function of the site. So you could think about the table to the left here is showing 3 things that you could map in quite a descriptive way. So street trees, graffiti, and a bike park. So you could show where those things were. So here is some graffiti on the site. Here are some street trees. Here is a bike park. But then you could go further than that, and you could actually talk about those as features that are performing a function. So you can make a decision to say, okay, so here is an example of green infrastructure, or here are some examples of trees being used as passive cooling for buildings. Or here are some examples of trees being used to make a sort of dense urban environment more friendly and a sort of more welcoming social space. Graffiti could be described as an example of antisocial behaviour, but of course graffiti is not just one kind of graffiti, so it would be helpful for us to know a bit more about that. It could also be seen as an example of urban art, so quite often now areas of the city commission artists to create graffiti art to reflect the character of the neighbourhood. It could even be seen as an example of a vibrant youth culture. So if it's an area that's very heavily graffitied, it could be, actually a sense of local pride or showing a particular kind of cultural importance to that area. Or it could be a sign of urban neglect. It's very much about the detail, really, and how you describe the function of that graffiti rather than just saying, here is some graffiti. Likewise, you could talk about a bike park as being an example of, part of the sustainable urban transport infrastructure, or an example of a socioeconomic hub. So if there's lots of people parking their bikes somewhere, is that because actually there's a lot to do in that area? That's why people have gathered there, or is it because they're parking it, say, by a train station in order to carry on their commute in some other way? Making these decisions requires you to look at spaces analytically rather than just see the features there in a descriptive format. So then once you've kind of gone through the thought processes of what to map, then you need to think about how to do it. And representing data on the map, I hope I've shown you some examples of very, very simple techniques that are really, really effective in terms of communicating. The techniques that you use for describing analytical data are the same ones as you would use for descriptive data. So it's just usually the same things, colouring in blocks of areas, adding lines and dashes and arrows. If you can think about the role of a key, so you can use symbols and colours and lines on the map, and then you can describe what they are in a key in the same way as you would do on a lot of the examples that I've shown you today. So we're talking about lines, arrows, colour blocks, symbols. And here's some examples of, although this is a professional urban design compendium graphic here, so this will have been produced on something like AutoCAD, but the techniques here are actually very simple. So again, we can see examples of different keys here. So this is describing what we're looking at in terms of the different colours and lines. But again, we're looking at dashed lines, areas that have been coloured in, so creating circles and colouring them in different colours and having circles of different sizes, different colour lines, talking about all these different things in terms of the road condition. Again, this is even more simple, it's just grey and grayscale shapes and lines. This one shows different kinds of green space in terms of private and public, using circles, lines, and different colours. And this one gets, slightly more complicated with these sort of, with these little symbols here, but you don't need to do that. But you can see basically that even with a professionally produced document, this is actually some very simple graphic techniques that you could emulate. The final cherry on the top in terms of producing a really good analytical map is to include academic annotation. So again, here is a professional piece of spatial analysis, and although you may look at that and think there's no way I could do that, actually you could. So all of the techniques that have been included in the supporting videos on mapping would enable you to do something that looked not that dissimilar to this. The final thing here I want to talk about is academic annotation. So what you can see here is, as well as the colour blocks on the map and the key, we've got lines leading to text boxes. So these are drawing our attention to certain features of the site where a little bit more descriptive information is needed, or a bit more analytical information is needed. So that technique is adding a text box and an arrow. Then the next thing is to think about what to put in that text box. And what I want you to think about is how you can produce very succinct references to academic literature that show that you understand that what you're looking at here is, something that is referenced in terms of the literature around spatial analysis. So we use references in visual pieces of work like this in exactly the same way as you would in an essay or a report. I've produced some very, very super simple examples of that here. So it's about what you put in the text box. And this is about the amount of information that you might want to include. You wouldn't want to get a lot more writing than this in your text boxes. So green infrastructure allows for the reduction in building footprint and higher density developments without compromising biodiversity or quality of life for residents. So that's saying, to include something like that on a spatial diagram would let me know that you understood not only what you were looking at, but also the relevance and importance of that as it links to some academic theory. Again, here's another one. Locating key services in central areas with good pedestrian connectivity supports sustainable transportation. I hope some of those techniques have been useful to you, and some of those differentiating between different kinds of data on maps has been useful to you. So we'll be talking about some of these themes more in the workshop, but thanks for watching.